This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I am Simone Fishburn, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury, and I'm joined today by Claus Zieler, Chief Commercial Officer at Astellas. Claus joined Astellas in 2019, having spent over a decade at Bayer and before that over a decade, I think, at Schering, with general management positions in several countries around the globe. He's risen fast at Astellas, becoming president of established markets in 2021 and chief commercial officer in 2023. Claus, welcome to the show. Now, you don't know this probably, but you are, in fact, the first chief commercial officer guest that we've had. And this is really important because it's such an important part of the conversation around drug development. And, quite often there is this chasm between the commercial teams and the R&D teams. And I hope in our discussion to bring out how tied at the hip these need to be and what the issues are that there really isn't and shouldn't be a chasm, maybe. So let's start with that interface. Astellas has what it calls a quote unquote focus area approach to R&D. And that involves approaching discovery from multiple perspectives. I think every company has its own terminology, but tell us what that actually means in practice. And as a result, what falls into and out of scope from that strategy?
Yeah. So thank you, Simone, and thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. The focus area approach that you mentioned is really a terminology that just refers to the triangle that I think comes to bear in every discovery process. At the end of the day, you need to understand the disease. You need to understand the technological modality, be it an antibody, be it a small molecule binding to a target, be it a gene that's replaced in the diseased body. So that's what we call the modality. But you also need to understand the biology. Right? So just understanding the disease clinically is not enough. You do need to understand the biology to know how do you intervene in that diseased setting in order to help the patient, because that's what we're trying to do. So the focus area approach really tries to combine the understanding of the disease, of the technological modality, and the detailed biology to understand where to target that modality to. That's really the answer to the fancy term of focus area approach.
Right. So what would what would be out of scope for you then? Like if, as you go around and you evaluate ideas and things, are there areas that you sort of say, well, we don't, is it because you might not have the right modality in-house, or how do you use that strategy to guide what you actually study and leave behind?
Yes, correct. So for instance, there might be a modality which we do not have a lot of know-how in. Let's say mRNA, right? The basis for the COVID vaccines that was so quickly developed and launched during the COVID crisis. Our company does not have that modality, so that would be clearly something that's out of scope on the modality side. But equally, we might decide that we have a modality that gets us, let's say, into a cardiology disease setting. Well, that is not a disease setting we would have a lot of know-how in. And again, we would define that as out of scope because that's not something our company would be the best owner of in terms of bringing an innovation through development to the market. So I think that answers your questions on out of scope.
Yeah, and it brings me really to this critical question of how R&D functions and commercial functions work together. Now, Astellas has taken risk, right? For example, in gene therapy programs, that's something you've done a lot. And, to me, that kind of suggests you've got to be on the same page. Maybe you can talk about how you work with the R&D teams, the commercial teams, around something like a high risk area and what it takes to make decisions in that area.
Yeah, so I think the general principle is that when you look back at that triangle of disease and modality and biology, it's the R&D teams that would contribute more on the modality and the biology part. It's the commercial team that would say, this is a disease area where an unmet medical need can translate into, access to medicines across the world, right? So that's where the commercial input comes, honestly, at a very early stage, at the interface of late research into early development, into saying, okay, this is how we can imagine taking an asset forward through the development process. What I would ideally like to see is that we have, rather than this classical idea of a handoff from one team to the next, that we create one continuous team from an early stage of identifying an asset all the way through to the launch and then later the LOE of an asset. I think that's still something that we will see in the future. But that would be my idea.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to that actually in a minute, because that's sort of a core question. But here's an example for me where I think in your Viloy program, you ran into some problems with patient deaths. You didn't drop the program and appeared to look forward for a path in a subset of patients. Now, that's a pretty hard internal decision, right? So is that driven by, was it a hard internal decision? Was there an immediate path forward on that? How can you talk a little bit about the meeting of R&D and commercial and when you come across hurdles like that?
So let me give you an example. There was a joint meeting of the research and the development leadership teams just very recently, just last month. Commercial was invited to that, even though it was a research-driven discussion about assets in research phase, and still it was a tripartite, if you want, meeting led by research, inviting the colleagues from the development, from clinical development, and inviting colleagues from commercial to discuss on how do we take certain asset ideas forward, what would be modalities, assets coming out of modality thinking into different disease areas, and exactly the questions that you asked. What would be in scope? What is high risk in scope? What is less risk in scope? What is out of scope? How do we build know-how in disease areas which we think we could be targeting, but we don't have today? Should we go in? Should we not go in? I think many companies go through similar discussions. I think where what I was so proud of in that meeting is that it took place at a very, very early stage in the entire process, which may not be so common in the industry.
Well, let's stay there, and it sort of syncs with what you said before, because I sort of feel that companies of the size of Astellas and larger, you have commercial teams, and so it's up to you. You can bring that culture where you want to be involved in research conversations or R&D conversations quite early. But smaller companies need to figure out when to build commercial. And, you obviously interact with a lot of them through partnerships and partnership conversations and so on. How early should even small companies be thinking about commercialization and even whether it's building teams or through partnerships? Quite often we hear them go, we'll talk about that later. Let's first of all get this program.
Yeah, let me answer your question on partnerships, because I happen to think that Astellas is extremely good at partnering. I think it's one of our core strengths. If you look at our portfolio, we've built our foray into oncology essentially in prostate cancer. That was the result of a partnership. Yeah, that was a partnership with Medivation, and Medivation was then later bought by Pfizer, and we continue with a very good partnership with Pfizer as our partner now on that asset. And similarly, if you look at more recent launches that we've made, our entry into urothelial cancer was a partnership with Seattle Genetics, right? There's an acquisition of Iveric Bio, which is a company we've been talking to actually for quite some time before we made the acquisition decision and started entering the ophthalmology area. So I think we're an excellent partner because of our, maybe it's part of our Japanese heritage, I don't know, but we are very good at treating the partner as an equal and saying to partners, look, we're in this together. We're trying to do the best for patients, and we're trying to do the best for the two companies that are partnering. So let's do this together. And that common approach, I think, binds us at the hip, and the common approach, I think, then results in a successful venture between the two partners contributing their individual know-how into a stronger whole that benefits patients.
Well, and there are more and more, one of the things we talked about previously and, that we hear about is small companies. Well, there's a couple of things. One is small companies want co-commercialization deals. The larger companies usually want to be in control of the commercialization. So first of all, let me ask you sort of how you view that and how comfortable you are with co-commercialization deals, or do you really think it's better for Astellas to be guiding that?
Look, at the end, it's a question of, are you entering a setup with an unresolved tension at its core? Because, like in a marriage, that's likely to explode at some point and not result in a positive outcome. Or are you entering a partnership with a very clear understanding of the interests of each partner, where you've come to a common ground on those interests and said, look, it may not be 100% what you expected, or it may not be 100% what I expected, but we've come to a resolution of that tension space in a way that is a win-win and represents a satisfactory outcome for either side. Because if you don't have that from the start, it's not going to go well. Yeah. If you do have that at the start, and that's what we always drive for, then I think you have a setup from the very start where you say, okay, the asset may take this turn or that turn in real life. We have a core principle that's been established between the two partners, which we will always come back to. Yeah, and we'll be able to amend terms, or we'll be able to steer the business in a way that always comes back to that fundamental principle that we established as the core principle guiding our partnership. I'm actually referring to a real life example when I say that, because in our contract with Seattle Genetics, we did have a core principle that guided us through that partnership, and it has served us well. When real life deviates from expectations, to say, okay, but our core principle that we always said we would adhere to is this. So let's come back to that core principle, and then let's align on the steps going forward. It's really served us very well.
That's a really great place. We're going to take a pause. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of your own launches and the future of your pipeline.
Thank you. That's the exciting part. Yeah.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by...
This September in Nashville, BioCentury launches Grand Rounds, a new interdisciplinary R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia. Join BioCentury and a rich roster of innovators and key thought leaders to identify leading-edge discoveries and discuss urgent challenges that must be solved to translate these innovations into product development and medical practice. Meet academic innovators, physician scientists, early-stage investors, and biopharma R&D leaders for 2 days of networking, partnering, and debate. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
We are back on the BioCentury Show with Claus Zieler, Chief Commercial Officer of Astellas. So, Claus, Astellas is gearing up to launch 4 new products simultaneously. Now, 2 of these are in oncology. That's an area where you've got some history. You've got Padcev, which is an ADC, with Keytruda for bladder cancer, Vyloy, approved in Japan for gastric cancer, and 2 of them are in new areas for you, ophthalmology and women's health, with Izervay for geographic atrophy and Veozar for menopause. So I want to start with talking about how you are operationalizing, I guess, guiding your operations, let's say, to launch 4 products at the same time. And what is your biggest challenge there?
I mean, you're absolutely right. 4 products, 4 product launches essentially going in parallel across the world in 4 different disease areas, all of which are new to us, is quite a challenge for us as a company. And I think, of course, it all comes down to the planning and the execution of a launch. And a lot of work goes in the beginning when we prepare for the launch, from global brand teams and market research going on to understand how to position the brand. And I think all companies in the industry pretty much do the same thing when we prepare for a launch. For me, the big value, I always say, planning and strategy is 30% of the value creation. The real value creation is with customers in the local markets. Yeah? And customers are always local. They have their local settings in terms of the way patients prepare when they come in for a visit. They may Google, they may not Google, depending on the geography. It depends on payer systems. The world really is quite diverse when it comes down to the local setting. And all of a sudden you're faced with, how do I take this global strategy and all these nice checklists of things that you have to prepare and make it work at the local level? Yeah? And that is where I think the quality of your team, the experience of your team, the people on the ground who know the customer, who interact with the customer, who know the payers, who understand the systems, who make it work in that local setting, really come to bear. Yeah? And I'm very proud of our teams, because we do have highly knowledgeable and really very sophisticated and experienced teams on the ground in our company. Without that, that would not be possible. But it's that art of translating a global strategy into that local setting, navigating that local setting, and making it work, on the ground at the local level, that I think creates most of the value for patients when we bring a new asset to market.
So can you talk a little bit more? Because I very much appreciate what you say and the importance of understanding the local environment and engaging in what you might even think of as an analog way. But we live in a rapidly changing world where data is more and more available, and not using data is going to end up hurting people who don't use it. So to what extent are you building data-driven and even AI capabilities into understanding, into creating that global strategy? Or, how versatile does your commercialization strategy have to be, given that people's habits changed? You talked about whether they're going to Google. Maybe by now they're getting their information on TikTok. I don't know. But it is a reality, because that's a patient's, it's not whether you want patients to be, accessing it via Facebook or TikTok or whatever. It's where they're getting their information from. So how versatile do you need to be in your strategy? Or is this something that you sort of channel via the medical practitioners, and they're the ones that guide that?
Yeah, well, let me take. The short answer is, of course, this is not a static environment. Of course, it's a moving environment. But before we go to something as high on everyone's radar screen as AI, let's just talk about the way the world has changed since I was a rep. When I was a rep, this was, believe it or not, in the 90s. We didn't even have smartphones. People think things were still paper-based, yeah? And doctors didn't have smartphones. So the channel was a one-dimensional channel. I, as a rep, visited you as a healthcare practitioner, and I was largely your source of information, maybe next to congresses. That world has completely revolutionized, especially in the last 10 years, where we now have internet availability, we have websites, we have email, we have webinars. Congresses are no longer just face-to-face opportunities. They're also digital opportunities to disseminate information. So that multi-access that the customer is using to access information is something we have to cater to. Now, the whole industry is doing that, obviously. It's not just Astellas. But how do we orchestrate that in a seamless way, in terms of a local brand team planning those activities across the different channels, some of them digital, some of them face-to-face, and how are we sure that we cater to the preferences that the healthcare practitioner would have? Because not every healthcare practitioner is the same. Some will have this preference, some will have that preference. Do we even know that? Do we record it? Can we action it? So that really, which is the basis of the omni-channel engagement, is, I think, where most of the industry right now is concentrating, is focusing on to improve the customer experience in accessing information from our end. Yeah? If you now then say, let's move forward into AI, yes, of course, AI will play a role in the future. And I think every company is experimenting with that. Is it firmly embedded yet? Probably not, right? We're at the first forays into understanding how does that technology now help us with, let's say, content creation for a certain segment or for a certain channel, and how do we apply that in an efficient manner? 5 years from now, we'll probably look back and say, oh, of course, that's how you use it. But right now, it's not so obvious at the start of the journey. So these are learning iterations. And of course, some of those learning iterations are driven by global teams, yeah, because they own the technology platforms and they would be the first to apply it. But at some point, it will have to, again, be titrated down to the local level, because if it's not applied at the local level, then you may have a potentially good resource. If it's not used, it doesn't add value to the customer at the end of the day. So again, I don't believe that the question is, should it be more global or should it be more local? I think the real question is, do we have a strong dialogue between the local teams who interact with customers, understand customers' needs, feed it back to global teams who have technology and platform solutions that can then be brought back down to the local level? It's the dialogue. The strongest dialogue makes the best company, not the strongest global or the strongest local that makes the best company, at least in my opinion.
So, traditionally and today, the vast majority of new product launches are really done by pharma companies. Even if the innovation often happens in small companies, and you've talked about the deals that you do, they're often leveraged, or really conducted and guided by the large pharma companies. There are more and more smaller companies that are aiming to commercialize products themselves. I had day one Jeremy Spender on the BioCentury Show recently talking about that for his company's products, which often center around pediatric oncology. I think in gene therapies, that's, or rare diseases, that might be a focus for some of those companies. Broadly, what are your thoughts about the ability of smaller companies to commercialize? And do you expect to see more of it? What's it going to take for them to be successful?
Yeah, I actually, it may surprise you, but in the partnering discussions that I mentioned earlier, I actually get that question a lot. We have all this technology and we have an asset that's ready to get to market in X number of years. How can I use my time to build my commercial capabilities? And I always advise focus, because, try to bring a new treatment to the world in a short period of time, from the US over Japan, China, Brazil, Germany, France, Italy, Turkey, Korea. You're going to face extremely diverse environments, payer systems, data requirements from different customer groups, be it in the regulatory or be it in the payer sphere, and you have to know all of that. Now, how do you know all of that and then input it into your R&D program, which is what we talked about earlier? It has to start at a very early stage when you define your clinical trials. What data will you be collecting? Well, you already have to understand the markets at that stage. How are you going to do that if you're not present in those markets yet? So, can you build commercial capabilities from scratch? Of course you can. Can you do it in multiple geographies across the world at the same time? That's a tremendous challenge for a small organization. I would advise, be very focused on a few markets where you think you can tackle it, and find partnerships to help you, at least with your first asset, to do it in other geographies. The fact of the matter is, the patent clock is ticking for all of us in the industry, irrespective whether we are a small company or a big company, right? So if you don't commercialize in a broad set of geographies in a short period of launch timings, you're going to lose value. So that's, I think, where partnerships come in, because no one can build that capability in that amount of breadth in that short a time. You just can't do everything at the same time, right? And so partnerships may be a solution for you, where you say, let me focus on building my capability in one or two, or just a very, very restricted geographical breadth, and then let's use partnerships to make that short, quick launch possible across the breadth of geographies, to recoup the value of the R&D investment. Now, that may be the first cycle, and then the second cycle may look different. But you can't do everything at the same time. You have to focus.
So I want to end by a couple of minutes talking about your own future pipeline, the things that are not yet being launched. And maybe let's start, I don't know how much we'll get through, but the cell and gene therapy focus of yours, what you're excited about then, and how you're already thinking. We've just talked about commercialization challenges. I mean, those have tremendous commercialization challenges. So how are you thinking about Astellas' cell and gene therapy portfolio?
Yeah. So, Simone, I would like to highlight two areas where I think we are extremely well positioned as Astellas to be leaders with new technologies. One is protein degradation. So the concept here is, imagine you have a disease and you've studied the biology of the disease, and you know exactly where in the pathway you need to intervene to alter the disease progression. Yeah. Now imagine, classically, that is a protein where you say, I need something to bind to it, be it an antibody, be it a small molecule, to inhibit a certain action. So, okay. Now imagine you have a protein which doesn't allow you to bind, or doesn't allow you to bind with the affinity to really have a strong, inhibition mechanism. But what if you could degrade that protein? And all of a sudden you're in protein degradation. And we're one of the leading companies in that technology area. So I want to now segue to gene therapy and cell therapy, but because I do think that's another leading technology that we have built. And let me here highlight in gene therapy, there are really two things that you need to have in parallel. You need to have, on the one hand, the understanding of the technology and how you apply it to a disease, but you also need the manufacturing capability. You have to have the two in parallel, because it's no good having the technology and then trying to look for a manufacturing organization that does that for you when that doesn't exist yet in the world. So you have to, as a company, think about, okay, I'm developing these things in R&D, but then how am I going to manufacture them? Once they reach a certain maturity in the R&D process, and then later on when you bring it to market. And so that's what we have at Astellas. We've invested in the R&D capability in gene therapy. We've also invested in the manufacturing capability in gene therapy. So we have the two that go together, and we can, of course, as in any innovation, there are issues in both parts, but we're working through those step by step in parallel, so we don't lose time once an asset comes out of R&D and requires the manufacturing capability.
Well, that's really been a very full answer, and we are out of time, but I want to thank you so much for joining today, and we will be watching the launches of those 4 products. Good luck with them.
Thank you, Simone. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.